I was going to say now for something completely different, but it's not. I think what's come up for me, or certainly the kind of I guess methodologically, was thinking about how the institutions at large work with different publics, and how we bring in different publics, their histories, their desires, their bodies into the institution. I think this is something that John, from a very different perspective, but has been engaged with for some time. So it's interesting, I think, as we kind of move across different frames, to think where are the links, where are the connections in the Venn diagrams. Huge pleasure to introduce John Byrne, a reader in the uses of art at Liverpool John Moores University, where he's also the director of the Uses of Art Lab. John has worked with the vanabbe on many different projects, beginning back in 2008 with the Autonomy Project, and he recently co-edited a really important book for us, or with us, with the Internationale Confederation, called The Constituent Museum: Constellations of Knowledge, Politics and Mediation. John will talk today about negotiating jeopardy. This is the title: Use Value, the Body and Political Dissent. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. A couple of things first, just to set the scene. Firstly, this is the first paper I've written for years. Usually I just make things up as I go along. And I've realised that, and it's nothing to do with the previous presentations, over those years that have passed, my eyesight's become terrible. So, forgive me for having to lean into this. This is the website for the Autonomy Project. It's really simple, theautonomyproject.org. There was one of 3 autonomy newspapers which was published in relation to this at work. So have a flick through this if you want. It's a good excuse for you to be able to look at your phones while I'm talking. And I guess one of the things that I, more seriously, that I kind of left out of this paper, which relates to what Nick was saying really importantly this morning, was underpinning all of this research, really going back to 2008, when we started to think about what would become the Autonomy Project. It's kind of an ongoing fascination of mine and several other people, with a kind of an impossible separation and contradiction that Marx tries to make in the opening pages of Das Kapital, where he tries to make a separation between use value and exchange value. And really interestingly, for me anyway, is he stages use value as something bodily, something that's qualitative, something that's ethical, and something that is an essential form of social, not individual labour. Whereas exchange value he sees as abstract, instrumentalised and instrumentalising, and quantitative. And I think that's really important in terms of some of the things that Nick was saying about how we move and interact with each other and our own bodies within spaces, and kind of critically and theoretically as well. And it's kind of underpins several of the gaps that we try to negotiate, and which causes so many problems. Right, so I'll just bat into this because I know time's short. In October 2011, the vanabbemuseum hosted the Autonomy Conference as part of the ongoing Autonomy Project. Set against the backdrop of the Arab Spring and a burgeoning Occupy Indignados movements, contributors to the debate included Jacques Rancière, Peter Osborne, Tanya Bagheera, Gerald Raunig, Isabel Laurie, Thomas Hershaw, Ruth Sondrager, Franco Berardi and Hito Steil. For those involved in the Autonomy Project itself, the conference began to mark a turning point in our thinking, scope and ambition. Rather than attempting to revivify the term autonomy as a means to enable more open, porous and social engagements with artworks in museums and gallery spaces, the project began to look towards the ideas of use value and usership as means to radically rethink the terms and conditions of what art institutions and our experience of art could be or become. In a keynote discussion with Charles Esha and Nikos Papastagiadis from the University of Melbourne, Jacques Rancière underlined this mood with his opening remark: "Autonomy is not one of my words. What Rancière went on to explain was scepticism with the etymological roots of autonomy, from autos, meaning self, and nomos, firstly meaning a part, a portion, or a territory, before coming to mean the law. And following from this, quote, the whole question of the relation between three terms, territory, selfhood, and self-legislation, unquote. In the light of this, Rancière went on to speak of the problematic relationship inhering between art and activism at a time of political crisis. Developing on his ideas of dissensus and politics as the act of the unseen and the unheard claiming a voice, Rancière subsequently asked, quote, how do you put together three things? The public manifestation of something that remained invisible, a break with the normal order of things, which also means with legality, and third, the creation of a form of empowerment of people. For me, these three related questions cut to the core of our struggle to release the term autonomy from its neoliberal capture, where it has increasingly become a uniaccentual term to validate radical funding cuts to the arts under the premise that the arts themselves are exemplary forms of self-reliance and self-governance. The Autonomy Project itself, which began in 2010, had its roots in the 2008 global financial crash, major bailouts to banks and financial institutions, and the resulting neoliberal response of global austerity. Within this context, cuts to the non-essential budgets, such as those set aside for the arts or education, marked a significant step change towards the total financial instrumentalisation of public institutions, such as museums and galleries, which had already been underway since the collapse of the Eastern Bloc from 1989. As a result, the Autonomy Project was initially an attempt to recapture and repurpose one of the key terms and conditions of modernist art practice, that of artistic autonomy, and to reopen its fixed and institutionalised meanings as a condition of disinterested aesthetic contemplation and engagement which only museums of modern art could provide. Instead, the Autonomy Project set out to revivify the term autonomy as a site of social, political and economic as well as aesthetic struggle, a territory to be fought for and to be fought over. Of course, as Charles Esha pointed out, this would mean that any repurposing of the term autonomy would have to fly in the face of common sense, as well as often strongly held and guarded beliefs. However, to see autonomy as a socially produced construct rather than as an a priori given, and as something that has to be fought for and taken from those who would misuse or misconstrue the term for the purposes of power and control, offered those involved in the project with an opportunity to imagine ourselves otherwise at a time of and within global crisis. However, what we didn't realise when we undertook the project was just how far-reaching its consequences might be. What started out as an attempt to rethink how publics or visitors to museums and galleries and their bodies might be able to experience art in a more democratic and meaningful way soon turned into the realisation that museums and galleries, as well as art itself, needed to be fundamentally rethought or reimagined if art's commodified absorption into the luxury tourism, leisure and cultural industries was to be avoided. Instead of thinking how we might re-democratise and reactivate the established terms and conditions which currently dictate a top-down and one-way public access to art, we began to think how museums and galleries could play a key role in the re-democratisation and reactivation of the public body itself via the uses of art. From my own point of view, this initially meant accepting that, under our current condition of neoliberal occupation, there is no longer any form of a priori alterity that can be offered by art, or for that matter, by the work or labour of art itself. Rather than seeing this admission as raising a white flag to neoliberalism, I argued that having no inside out or outside in would allow us to begin reimagining the condition of capitalist colonisation that, to paraphrase Mark Fisher, currently occupies the horizons of the thinkable. Instead of falling back into the historical trap of art for art's sake autonomy, where useless usefulness and purposeless purposelessness are seen as ways in which art can simply fly in the face of financial instrumentalisation, I began to argue that the condition of neoliberal occupation was asymmetrical. What I meant by this was that the languages of alterity in the left, once so clearly distinguishable from the terms and conditions that demarcated the right, had already been successfully occupied and repurposed within neoliberal discourses of self-management, deregulation and fiscal responsibility. And if this was the case, then any form of socially and politically radical art would now have to recapture, reoccupy and repurpose its own terms and conditions of use and usership from within the operational overcodes of globalised neoliberal logic. One way of beginning to think how such forms of recapture and reactivation can become possible is, I would argue, offered by Rancière. However, I'm not thinking of Rancière's suggestion of a metapolitics of aesthetics here. Instead, I'm thinking here of the Rancière of the Knights of Labour, the workers' dream in 19th century France, first published in 1981. Of the Rancière who looked back to the future at the historical struggle of artisans, workers and craftsmen who used writing and the growing availability of ground-up political publications in the 1840s as a means to reuse and challenge existing languages of power and control. In doing so, Rancière consciously avoids the trap of projecting a revolutionary and proletarian class that is yet to be. A mythologised class somehow standing at the ready to free itself from the shackles and yoke of capitalist oppression, when, and only when, it is brought to the full consciousness of its own servitude by enlightened bourgeois revolutionaries. Instead, he weaves a more plausible picture of everyday micro-political dissent, a rhizomatic reuse of the existing languages of mastery made by a class that is already fully conscious of its own fixed position within the hierarchies of power. For Rancière, this already existing class of fully conscious workers who are willing to reuse a language that is always too mutable and porous to be owned completely by the hand of their masters, contains within it more evolutionary potential than an idealised and abstracted proletariat to be. And I quote from Rancière, perhaps the truly dangerous classes are not so much the uncivilised ones sought to undermine society from below, but rather the migrants who move at the borders between classes, individuals and groups who develop capabilities within themselves which are useless for their improvement of their material lives and which, in fact, are liable to make them despise material concerns. This kind of work or labour of art, this continual and migrant reuse and reconfiguration of the possibilities offered by language, technology and existing architectures and protocols of power is now, I would argue, the kind of work or labour that the work of art has now become. Within the asymmetrical context of neoliberal occupation, the use value of art becomes the activation of non-alienated forms of social labour which allow for the possibility of alternative and otherwise to be kept open as resources for thinking and doing against the grain. And if there are no pre-given alterities or asylum-like safe havens from which these activities can be launched, then the work or labour of art must become one of socially and collectively recapturing the very terms and conditions of possibility itself. If this is so, then the work or labour of art cannot simply remain a condition of refusal. It must also entail the activity of making and doing otherwise. However, if Rancière begins to offer us an overall strategy for the work or labour of art as a form of imminent resistance through micro-political acts of recapture and redistribution, we might also wish to begin thinking more tactically. What, we might ask, really happens to the role and function of art when the hallmarks of modernist avant-garde resistance have long since been co-opted by the rhetorics of financial capitalism and, more specifically by the economically driven model of the culture industries. For me, another way of beginning to think and act our way through and out of this impasse was offered during the Autonomy Symposium by Franco Berardi, who began to rehearse some of his arguments that would subsequently form the basis of his 2012 book, The Uprising on Poetry and Finance. For Berardi, the radical deregulation of neoliberal capitalism is predicated upon the increasing abstraction of language from the body. Deregulatory logic, he suggests, relies on the possibility of endlessly connecting and reconfiguring language into regulated, recombinable and meaningless components, which of course can be instrumentalised and financialised. This, he argues, runs counter to the open, porous and poetic use of language as a fluid form of conjunction, as an endlessly open means of understanding ourselves and each other through evolving forms of communication and growth. In the light of this, Berardi proposes that the new job of the artist or poet is to return non-alienated forms of porous, mutable and productive language to the physical and social body. Such uses of language, I would argue, provides us with the material means to challenge the established status quo of economic predicates and determinants through the material production of new social meanings as fluid, heteronymous and conjunctive bodies of knowledge. These bodies of knowledge, as networks of active commoning and resistance, would be capable of escaping the gravity of power and its reliance on increasingly interchangeable, centralised and regulated forms of connectivity. In this scenario, the job of the artist or poet becomes the work or labour of keeping language alive as a form of social struggle when there are no longer any simple distinctions between autonomy and heteronomy. If this is the case, then it also follows that the work or labour of art is no longer to reunite, bridge or combine the seemingly irreconcilable or torn halves of an integral freedom. It is to operate as a form of social possibility or use value within an already networked and saturated world of deregulatory and delusionary logic. But how, we might ask, is it possible to imagine, let alone effect, such a strategy within a dispersed and networked society that is already predicated upon forms of alienation, instrumentalisation and abstraction on every level? And how can we even begin to imagine forms of resistance and organisation based upon the use value of art when all forms of traditional organisation and resistance, class, race, gender, religion, sexuality, party affiliation, seem to be collapsing into each other under the weight of flexibilisation and the exploitation of precarious labour? How does one radicalise, collectively or individually, when all faith in the mechanisms of inherited political affiliation would seem to be lost? And as we know, the stakes are high. When we began to discuss these ideas at the Autonomy Symposium in 2011, the ground-up activism of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movements seemed to be offering us examples of spontaneous and collective resistance. However, their rapid and often violently brutal reappropriation into more vicious forms of network and centralised governmental suppression has, once again, brought me back to rethinking opposition on a tactical, micro and rhizomatic level. This is not because the institutions of power appear to be impregnable, but precisely because the mechanisms of neoliberal occupation now depend heavily on forms of day-to-day complicity, which, I would argue, can best be disrupted through the recapture and vital redistribution of non-alienated forms of labour. Within this context, perhaps the most decisive contribution to the Autonomy Symposium resided in Tanya Bagheera's call for an international association of arte utile. What would it be like, Bagheera asked, if artists become less concerned with offering hypothetical solutions to global problems and, instead, began to act as instigators in the production of local solutions to matters of urgency? Held within the idea of arte utile, or, more specifically, within the commitment to use art as a tool for the shared production of one-to-one scale and real-time social, political and economic alternative, resides the possibility for the constituent production and exchange of shared knowledge as an active form of commoning. Moreover, this commitment to the uses of art as a social tool for effecting real change also underpins the possibility for the constituent production and subsequent social extraction of use value from within the proposed framework of Museum 3.0. It is also here that the ongoing work or labour of the constituent museum, the act of negotiating jeopardy, as I call it, of recapturing and repurposing the very possibility of non-alienated and productive social labour, becomes visible in the production of local, though networked, bodies of rhizomatic knowledge. At the same time as this, and as Rancière and Berardi demonstrate, this activist knowledge is something that can be taken as well as produced from within, by reoccupying language, by stealing gold from the gods, by using one's arms and hands to transgress the borders that would fix types of labour in their place. However, if this form of recapture from within is to be the new work or labour of art, we must also accept that those borders are no longer clearly defined or fixed. They now appear as complex and ineffable flows of semio-capital that continually blur the boundaries of public and private space, and which are increasingly capable of financialising and capitalising every form of online and offline exchange. So consequently, and in conclusion, such a seismic shift in our uses of art would come with the responsibility to accept that the fundamental terms and conditions of a primarily Western and modernist engagement with art, as we know it or knew it to be, are surrendered. This process will mean more than a simple repurposing of terms such as autonomy. It will mean the wholesale decolonisation and demodernisation of our current institutions of embodied knowledge through processes of active archiving and the open source co-production of new possibility and shared negotiable meaning. In turn, this will depend upon a shift away from making sense of or evaluating art in terms of its aesthetic or autonomous role and function. Instead, it will demand that we begin to rethink and evaluate the role and function of art in terms of its social use and use value. Currently, I would argue that the available tools for repurposing our evaluation of art in terms of its use value reside outside the common purview of a Western epistemology of art. Instead, they reside in ground-up oppositional forms of active reimaginings and remakings of the social and political body, such as those offered by the democratic confederalism of Abdullah Öcalan and epitomized by the slow and decentered non-representational politics of Zapatismo. However, if we are not prepared to accept this challenge of actively using art as a tool for participating in the production of new bodies of knowledge and, instead, we prefer to cling on to the cherished assumption that art, as we know it or knew it to be, somehow offers an alterity beyond our current conditions of asymmetrical struggle, then we run the risk of standing on the sidelines as the pressing concerns of outright dictatorship and environmental catastrophe engulf us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. John, could you put that paper in a little bit of context in terms of the work you're doing? This is you began with the Autonomy Project, but this is a book project, this is a...
Yeah, and very kindly, in collaboration with the vanabbemuseum and via the Deviant Research Strand, putting together a book, Negotiating Jeopardies, the use value and the work or labour of art. And these ideas kind of form the first of 4 sections, which is kind of the methodology to the book. The second is a review of some common histories in terms of use value and usership. The second looks at the university and the Museum of Art Utile. And the third tries to apply these forms of thinking to a range of projects most of which come from the practices of the vanabbemuseum and the projects we've been involved in. So it was an offer to look back at really sort of 10 or 12 years' work and to begin making sense of it, also to try and use that as an act of translation to give a toolkit or a starting point for rethinking activism. And I think Nick and Charles and Stephen and Annie as well invited me to do that because I'm kind of quite bleak and I don't really kind of hold on to many of the cherished notions that usually trip up our attempts to escape our own gravity, which is odd for me as I work in an art school. And the usual pronouns that are applied to me when I'm doing well are it and that.
Any questions for John? I have maybe one question which I don't know how I'm going to finish, so let's see how it goes. Just to kind of pick up on, I guess, the different flavours or textures of the 3 papers in this session. How do we, or can we think about the very embodied, personalised, subjective processes of research, of kind of putting art to use with what you talk about as a social function, a social charge, a social potential, and how do we think about the kind of some ideas of subjectivity, embodied research with some of the allusions to commoning that you've, or should we not? Should we?
I think we should. I mean, without sort of trying to play the party game of got the subject matter together, I think all of the papers today, including this one, kind of had some common themes, and one of them clearly is beginning to use research as a means to produce new and kind of common knowledge, as opposed to trying to reinterpret quite fixed sets of meanings that we agree as some kind of common denominator starting point. I mean, starting research and then kind of going off and getting involved in the scene or trying to develop projects in a university or an art school in order to get led on somewhere, and clashing that with Irish country and Western music and Jolene are kind of fantastic examples of kind of how we might use art and research to kind of begin to offer possibilities for thinking ourselves otherwise, rather than, as Tanya Bagheera says, simply taking the kind of the Western canon of artistic ego and pretending that we can use art to offer a solution.
Sorry, so in relation to, thinking through that and then going back to that original question you were talking about from the irreconcilable distinction at the beginning of this capital, but in relation to use value and exchange value, is that it?
Yeah.
Because use is kind of a word that always sets off alarm bells, right? It's like, it's because it's a synonym of instrumentalization, and then, so anyway, that's just an ongoing problematic when you're thinking about these things through, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I kind of like remembered it from, and we were also reminded about it in 2011, Frederick Jameson. There was a kind of a big upswell after the financial crash, like Marxism became popular again, after we were told that it didn't matter anymore because, you know, it was the end of history and the end of man. And it's precisely because that problematic we wanted to reuse it. You know, the very history of the Industrial Revolution understandably leads to a pathway of art for art's sake, precisely to give us hope against the total instrumentalisation of our lives in the factory. Yet we've ended up with either total instrumentalisation or a useless notion of autonomy in art, which is actually now so financially predicated as tourism and leisure industry. Where do you find something else out? Let's look back to this notion of use value as something that's bodily, something that's social, something that allows us to produce and make, not in a crafty sense, but in terms of actually building the possibility of alternative and future. Something that's neither nostalgic or utopianly futurological.
You're not that much of a pessimist.
No, I kind of like, undermine myself sometimes, because when you start, talking about, well, let's rethink the whole game.
Yeah.
Cross-ugly.
On that note, I want to say a huge thank you to John Byrne.
Thank you.